Up until a certain point in human history, people seem to have had very little sense of time in the way that you and I think of time. In fact, in many parts of the world, that may still be true even today. When I say, as we think of time, I mean the conception that we have that there was some definite point in the distant past at which time can be said to have begun, and from which time has then proceeded in some orderly and measurable fashion, perhaps toward some equally definite point in the distant future, when time may in some sense be said to have come to an end. We think of time, we think of a beginning and an end with a measured passage from one to the other. But people in ancient times, at least what we call ancient times, didn't think that way. They didn't think of time as having a definite beginning and then proceeding towards some ultimate end. Instead, they thought of time as an endless series of cycles in which nothing new ever really happens. It's just the same thing happens over and over again. And at the end of any one cycle, you simply have the beginning of another one. Cycles then that endlessly repeat themselves. So there's not really a beginning or an end. And it's understandable why they may have thought this way, since living, as most people did in ancient times, as hunter-gatherers or farmers, life for them was experienced almost entirely in terms of the cycle of the seasons, with each year giving way to another in ever-repeated fashion. The earth came to life every spring with the planting of seeds, which then grew into plants throughout the summer, that bore fruit in the fall and then died in the winter. And then it starts all over again as the earth comes back to life every spring. And this happens every year. It never changes. Now, that way of thinking did begin to change somewhere around the year 500 BC. Now, why that particular time, I really don't know. Though there is a very interesting historical novel written a number of years ago by Gore Vidal, which is called Creation, that has some very interesting speculation along those lines. But it was about that time, and presumably for similar reasons, that the famous story of creation in Genesis was composed, probably during the time of the Babylonian exile. The same time that the famous prophet that we know only as 2nd Isaiah begins to talk about God as the Creator. Astonishingly enough, the first such reference to God in the Jewish tradition. For the first time at that point, people seem to be looking beyond the narrow dimensions of their own lives, looking beyond the cycle of the seasons to a much larger frame of reference, to a sense of time with a definite beginning and heading toward a definite end, a sense of history on a grand scale. God's time, not ours, shall we say. Well, it is that same prophet, the one that we call 2nd Isaiah, who does talk about God the Creator, who then talks about God acting in history, about God powerfully intervening at certain periods, and in fact goes on to declare that God was doing that in their day, that God was doing something new, was returning the people of Israel home from their exile, just as God had acted earlier in Israel's history to free them from their slavery in Egypt. But this was something new. It was a new beginning, and it really was a new beginning for Israel. But after all the excitement of the initial return of the exiles and the challenges of rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple, after all that excitement, things began to settle down once again into a routine, into a life where nothing ever really seemed to change all that much, where life was once again lived out in the rhythm of the seasons, and there was very little sense of anything new ever happening. Just the same old routines over and over again, which seem to repeat themselves each and every year. Just as for us in our lives, where many years it just seems it's the same old thing happening over and over again, where we do the same old things the same old ways and really don't much think about it ever changing. But while for long stretches of time it may appear as if nothing ever is really changing, it is. It's always changing. And so at certain points in time, the old gives way to the new with something of a bang, roughly the social equivalent of an earthquake, which can be a real shock to people who are long accustomed to their unchanging routines. I think we can look at the life and ministry of Jesus in precisely that light, because he was a shock. Although following closely on the heels of John the Baptist, Jesus was no John the Baptist. In fact, in many ways, John the Baptist actually had more in common with the prophet Elijah, who had lived 800 years before him, than he did with Jesus, who was his exact contemporary. Because something new had happened. The old was giving way to something different. God's time was breaking into our settled routines and shaking them up, to put it mildly. And then, as now, those kinds of shocks were not always appreciated. In his description of Jesus' baptism by John in the River Jordan, Mark is actually signaling to the reader just how great a change Jesus represented. How new was Jesus? For according to Mark, as Jesus emerged from the waters of the Jordan, the Spirit of God hovered like a dove over the face of the waters, and a voice from heaven declared him to be the beloved one in whom God was well pleased. In other words, God saw that it was good. And if that sounds familiar, it is no accident, because it's the story of creation all over again, using the same images, even the same words that are found in the creation story in Genesis. In other words, Mark is telling us that this is not just another prophet carrying a message from God like all of the prophets before him, any more than this was just another baptism for the forgiveness of sins. No, this was something much greater. This was God recreating the world, just as surely as God had created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. And this was a new creation, a new beginning in the power of the Holy Spirit. That same Holy Spirit which had swept over the waters at the dawn of time. Throughout human history, the power of the Holy Spirit at work in and through us has shaken up our world in ways that can quite literally be called new beginnings. Times when it became clear to us that God was in fact doing something new. Though to be perfectly accurate, it was never really God doing something new, since God had been at work all along. It's just that we, caught up in our own routines, completely absorbed in the rhythms of our own lives, we had lost sight of what God was up to. And when suddenly for whatever reason, we realized what was going on and just how out of sync we were with God's doing in God's time, well, then it struck us as God doing something new, even something shockingly new. But the newness was to us, not to God. The Protestant Reformation was just such a new beginning, when the power of the Holy Spirit at work in the lives of people like Martin Luther shook medieval society out of its lethargy and breathed new life into the church, yet another new beginning. A new beginning which in time transformed all of Europe with shock waves that extended all the way to the shores of the New World. Our Constitution, our constituting of ourselves as a new nation was another new beginning, when in the course of human events it became necessary to throw off the shackles of the old routines and build something new. Something more in line with what we sensed God was doing among us. And something new is happening yet again, both in the church at large and in our own congregation, as in every congregation, at least every congregation that's still alive and attuned to the Holy Spirit. The denominational structures that have defined and even divided the church over the past 500 years, ever since the Reformation, those structures undoubtedly served a purpose for a very long time. But just as undoubtedly, they have outlived their usefulness. And we're now in the process of moving in fits and starts towards some new alignment, though what that will be and what form it will take and how we will get there is not evident at all. Certainly not evident to me. But what is evident is that something is happening. Something new. A new beginning. The same kind of process is playing out, though on a much smaller scale, in each congregation, including our own. The board and committee structure that has served us for so well for so long, and which is in fact still on the books and still in our bylaws, that structure is really not functioning very well these days. Not because people aren't doing their jobs or carrying out their responsibilities, but because it's simply not the way things get done today. And while businesses and many other organizations have long since moved away from that style of operation, the church, which tends to move glacially, if at all, has not. And all that's going to change. It's got to change, frankly, if we're to retain our vitality as an organization with a mission to accomplish. Here, at least, I think we have made some tangible progress toward a new and better way of doing our work, though we certainly still have a long way to go. Actually, as I approach retirement, I feel a little like John the Baptist must have felt when he prepared to hand over the reins to a successor that he knew was likely to do things very differently than he had. As John put it, I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Because John knew that something new was happening, that there was a new beginning. And in much the same way, I think I may well have more in common with someone like Albert Barnes, the pastor of this church in the 1830s, than I will with your new pastor, who's likely to be a very different kind of person from me in all kinds of ways. Because God is doing something new. It is a new beginning for all of us. And thank God for that. Because it means we're still alive. And we're still a part of God's history, moving toward God's end in time.